The dust from the county road hung in the late August air, thick and golden in the 4 o'clock sun. Arthur Jensen saw it first, a half-mile out from his own lane. He was coming home in his '65 Ford F100, the one with the straight-six engine that purred like a sewing machine and the passenger door that you had to slam just right. He eased his foot off the gas, letting the truck coast. Something wasn't right. The dust cloud was too big for a car, and it was moving away from his farm, not toward it. It was the heavy, churning dust of a big rig. He turned into his lane, the gravel crunching under the Ford's worn tires. And then he saw it. Parked right where his father's 1951 Farmall M was supposed to be, was a monster. It was a John Deere 4020, gleaming in the obnoxious, arrogant green that seemed to be taking over the county. It had a cab, for God's sake. A cab with tinted glass and a silver canister on the roof that he knew was for air conditioning. It looked alien, a giant green insect dropped from another world onto the familiar, hard-packed earth of his farmstead. His heart hammered against his ribs. He scanned the yard. The old M was gone. In its place was this monument to debt. He saw the rig then, just turning onto the county road at the end of his lane. It was a long flatbed from the implement dealer in town, and perched on its back, looking small and pathetic and betrayed, was the dull red of his Farmall. He didn't even put the Ford in park. He yanked the emergency brake, shoved the door open, and was halfway across the yard before his son, Roy, came out of the machine shed, wiping his hands on a rag. Roy had a smile on his face, a broad, proud, foolish smile that Art wanted to wipe off with the back of his hand. "Dad, you're home early. What do you think? Isn't she a beauty?" Roy gestured with the greasy rag toward the John Deere. Art didn't look at the green tractor. He kept his eyes locked on the flatbed disappearing down the road. "What did you do, Roy?" His voice was quiet, dangerously low. Roy's smile faltered. He was 24, strong as a young bull, but he still shrunk a little under his father's gaze. "I made a deal, Dad. It's time we modernized. That old M, she was tired. The dealer gave us a great trade-in value on this 4020. More power, power steering, a cab to keep the dust and heat off. We can get the fall plowing done in half the time." Art finally turned to look at his son. He saw the eagerness in his eyes, the belief that he had done something smart, something to make his father proud. It made the anger burn even hotter. Gave us a trade-in value? There is no us in a decision like that, boy. That tractor was mine. It was your grandfather's before me. He bought it new in the fall of '51, with cash from 2 good years of corn. It never had a lien against it. It never owed a man a dime. It was paid for. "But Dad, this is better. It's progress," Roy pleaded, his voice rising. "Everyone's trading up. The Petersons just bought a new 1466 from International. We can't keep up with an old 2-row planter and a tractor from before the Korean War." "I don't give a damn about the Petersons," Art's voice cracked like a whip. "They can bury themselves in banknotes for all I care. That red tractor, that tractor put you through school. It fed you. It paid for the very shirt on your back. It wasn't just a piece of iron, you damn fool. It was our history. It was our freedom. And you traded it for a monthly payment." He pointed a calloused, trembling finger at the green machine. "And what does that cost? What's the note on that thing?" Roy looked down at his boots. "It's manageable, Dad. With the new ground we're renting, the numbers work. I had the man from the bank run them myself." "The man from the bank?" Art scoffed, the words tasting like poison. "The man from the bank doesn't have to get up in the dark and pray for rain. He doesn't get grease under his fingernails trying to fix a broken hydraulic line on a Sunday morning. His solution to everything is a signature on a dotted line. Art turned his back on his son and the new tractor. He stared down the lane at the fading cloud of dust. He could feel the vibration of the rig through the soles of his work boots. He made a decision. It wasn't even a choice. It was an instinct, a reflex against a profound violation. He strode back to the Ford, yanked the door open, and climbed in. "Dad, where are you going?" Roy shouted, jogging after him. "We need to talk about this." Art fired up the straight six. It caught instantly. He slammed the gear shift into first. "We're done talking," he said, not looking at his son. He gunned the engine, spun the tires in the gravel, and shot out of the lane, chasing the ghost of his father's legacy down the road. The dealer's truck was a big international Transtar, and it wasn't setting any speed records. Art kept his foot pressed to the floor, the old Ford's engine whining in protest. The needle on the speedometer crept past 65, then 70. The truck rattled and shook, the wind whistling through the cracks in the window seals. He didn't care. He kept his eyes fixed on the red tractor shrinking on the flatbed ahead. He caught up to him 2 miles later, just before the turnoff to the state highway. Art laid on the horn, a long, desperate blast. He pulled alongside the big rig, waving his arm out the window. The truck driver, a young man with a greasy cap, glanced over, his eyes wide with surprise. Art pointed frantically at the shoulder of the road. The driver hesitated, then shrugged and hit his signals, the hiss of the air brakes cutting through the roar of the engines. Art pulled his Ford in front of the semi and was out of the cab before the dust settled. He walked back to the driver, who was leaning out of his window. "What's the problem, mister? Everything all right?" the driver asked. "There's been a mistake," Art said, his voice still tight with adrenaline. "A misunderstanding. That tractor," he pointed up at the Farmall, "is not for sale." The driver chewed on a toothpick. "Well, your boy sure thought it was. Signed the papers and everything. I just haul 'em." "My boy was wrong," Art said flatly. "What was the trade-in value? The dollar amount you gave him for it?" The driver squinted. "Don't know offhand. $600, maybe $700. It's an old model." "Old, but it's mine," Art said. "You call your boss. You tell him Art Jensen is on the side of County Road G with you, and he wants to buy his tractor back, for cash, right now." The driver looked from Art's face, set like granite, to the old Ford pickup, then back. He saw something in the old man's eyes that told him this wasn't a negotiation. He pulled a radio handset from its cradle. "Breaker 19, this is Big Red. You got your ears on, Frank?" The radio crackled back. "Go for Frank." "Yeah, Frank, I'm out on County G. I got that Jensen trade-in on the back. Well, the old man himself is out here. Says the boy didn't have the right to sell it. Wants to buy it back." There was a long pause, filled with static. "Put him on," the radio squawked. The driver handed the handset down to Art. "He wants to talk to you." Art took the receiver. "This is Jensen." "Art, Frank, over at the dealership. What's all this about?" "It's simple, Frank. My son made a mistake. That tractor has been in my family for 20 years. It's not for sale. I'll pay you whatever you gave him for it, plus $100 for your driver's time and trouble. I want it off that truck." There was another pause. Art could picture Frank in his air-conditioned office, leaning back in his chair, running the numbers. Frank was a businessman, but he was also a local. He knew Art. He knew his reputation. A man who paid his bills on time and never asked for credit. "Art, the paperwork is signed," Frank said, his voice weary. "The new 4020 is on your property. The deal is done." "The deal is not done until my tractor is back in my barn," Art stated, his voice unwavering. "I've got my checkbook right here, or I can go into town and get you cash. Your choice. but that Farmall is not going to your lot." The silence stretched on. Finally, the radio crackled again. "All right, Art. All right. You're a good customer. Tell you what, you give my driver a check for $800. He'll unload it for you right there. But, Art, that 4020 is still your boy's problem. The loan papers are already on their way to the bank in Des Moines." "I understand," Art said. "The boy made his bed. He can lie in it." He handed the receiver back to the driver. "We have a deal. Now, before I tell you what happened when Art got that tractor back to the farm, I have to ask you all something. Have you ever had to buy back something that was rightfully yours? Something a family member gave away without asking? Let me know down in the comments, because what Art did next, well, it set the course for the next 20 years on that farm." The driver unstrapped the chains, holding the Farmall M to the flatbed. He lowered the ramps with a clang of steel on asphalt. Art watched, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wrote the check on the hood of his Ford, the pen scratching against the paper. $800. It was a painful sum, money he'd earmarked for new cultivator shovels and seed for next spring, but it was a price he had to pay. He handed the check to the driver, who folded it and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "She's all yours, old-timer. You want me to start her up for you?" "I can manage," Art said curtly. He climbed up onto the familiar cast-iron seat. The metal was still warm from the sun. His hands found the controls without looking, the throttle, the choke, the ignition switch. He pulled the choke out halfway, twisted the key, and stomped on the starter pedal. The big C248 four-cylinder engine turned over once, twice, then coughed to life with a puff of blue smoke and a deep, rumbling idle that vibrated right through his bones. It was a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. He eased the clutch out, put the tractor in gear, and carefully backed it down the ramps. He didn't wait for the truck to leave. He just turned the Farmall toward home and started driving, the big lugged tires thumping a steady rhythm on the pavement. The 2-mile drive back to the farm was the longest of his life. Every house he passed, he felt their eyes on him, this old man on his ancient tractor. He knew the story would be all over the county by supper time. When he turned back into his own lane, Roy was standing there, right next to the shiny new John Deere, his arms crossed. He watched as Art drove the Farmall past him, not giving him a second glance, and parked it in its rightful spot in the old barn, the one his grandfather had built. He shut the engine off, and the sudden silence was deafening. Art swung his leg over the side and dropped to the concrete floor. He walked over to the workbench, picked up a clean rag, and began wiping the road dust from the Farmall's faded red hood. Roy appeared in the wide doorway of the barn, a silhouette against the bright afternoon sun. "So that's it? You spent $800 just to make a point?" Art didn't stop wiping. "It wasn't a point, it was a principle," he said without looking up. "And it wasn't your $800. It could have been ours. That money could have gone toward the payment on the 4020. Roy's voice was filled with frustration. "Don't you see? You're holding us back, Dad. You're stuck in the past." Art finally stopped and turned to face his son. He tossed the rag onto the workbench. "Let's get something straight. That green thing out there," he gestured with his chin toward the yard, "is yours. You bought it. You make the payments on it. You pay for the fuel. You pay for the dealer to come out when one of its fancy computers decides to quit. You work it on the 80 acres you cash rent. That is your business." He slapped the fender of the Farmall. The sound echoed in the quiet barn. "This, and the 706s, and the old Gleaner combine, and every other piece of iron on this farmstead that is paid for in full. This is mine. I will work the home quarter, same as I always have. We'll see who's standing when the bills come due." The line had been drawn. From that day on, the Jensen farm was two separate operations running on the same piece of land. It was a strange and silent war, fought with plows and planters. Roy, with his powerful new 40-20, could plow the rented 80 in a day and a half. He'd sit high up in his air-conditioned cab, the radio playing, while Art spent 3 days on the home quarter with the old Farmall, eating dust, the sun beating down on his neck, the roar of the engine his only company. The neighbors noticed, of course. Dale Peterson, who farmed the section to the west, would slow his new International 1466 as he drove by, shaking his head at the sight of Art on the old M. At the grain elevator, the talk was always the same. "Poor Roy," they'd say, "saddled with that stubborn old man. Kid's got ambition, but his own father is holding him back." Art heard the whispers. He felt the pitying looks at church on Sunday. It stung, but it didn't change a thing. He found a strange comfort in the old ways, in the familiar struggle. He knew every bolt and gasket on the Farmall. One morning, the magneto gave up the ghost. It wouldn't throw a spark. Roy, seeing him struggling, said, "Just call the dealer, Dad. They can have a new one out here this afternoon." Art just grunted. He spent the entire morning taking the magneto apart on his workbench, cleaning the points with a fine file, carefully checking the gap with a feeler gauge, and retiming it to the engine. He knew the precise smell of the old oil and the specific feel of the impulse coupling catching. By noon, he had it back on the tractor, and it fired on the first crank. The repair cost him nothing but time, and a little bit of skin off his knuckles. 2 weeks later, a hydraulic line on Roy's 40-20 burst. Green fluid bled all over the field. Roy didn't have the specialized tools or the metric wrenches to fix it. He had to call the dealer. The service truck took 4 hours to get there. The mechanic spent 20 minutes replacing the hose and handed Roy a bill for $150. $100 for the service call, $50 for the part and labor. Art watched from the fence row, saying nothing. The first few years were hard. Fuel prices started to climb after the OPEC oil embargo in '73. Fertilizer costs went through the roof. Roy's profit margins on the rented ground were razor-thin. He was working twice as hard, covering twice the acres, but after he made the land payment, the fuel bill and the tractor payment, his bank account didn't look much different from his father's. He grew quiet and sullen. The easy confidence he'd had on the day he bought the John Deere was gone, replaced by a permanent worry line etched between his brows. But then, things started to change. The world suddenly developed an insatiable appetite for American grain. The Russians were buying wheat and corn by the shipload. The Secretary of Agriculture, a man named Earl Butts, got on the television and told farmers to plant fence row to fence row. He told them to get big or get out. And for a while it seemed like he was a prophet. The price of corn, which had hovered around $1.50 a bushel for years, suddenly shot up to $2, then $2.50. By 1974, it was clearing $3 at the elevator. Land values, which had been stable for a generation, went berserk. The same ground that sold for $500 an acre was now fetching $2,000, then $3,000. The banks, flush with cash, were practically giving money away. Interest rates were low, and the loan officers were farmers' best friends, telling them to leverage their newfound equity, to expand, to buy more land, more equipment. For Roy, it was a vindication. The big payments on the 40-20 suddenly seemed small. With $3 corn, he was making a fortune on his rented 80. The worry lines on his forehead smoothed out. The confidence returned, bigger and brasher than before. He started talking about the future again. "See, Dad," he said one evening at the supper table, pushing a pile of figures, scribbled on a napkin across to his father. "I told you, the numbers work. We're sitting on a gold mine." Art studied the napkin. The numbers were impressive, but they were all based on one thing: the high price of corn. "The price can go down just as fast as it went up, son," he said quietly. "No way," Roy scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "The whole world wants what we grow now. This is the new reality. We've got to expand. Old man Hemmings is looking to sell the 80 acres that borders our north field. We could pick it up, work it with the 40/20. "With what money?" Art asked. "With the bank's money, of course. They'll lend it to us in a heartbeat. Our land is worth 4 times what it was 5 years ago. We've got the equity." "That equity isn't real until you sell," Art warned. "On paper, you're rich. In reality, you're just deeper in debt." But Roy wouldn't listen. He saw his father not as wise, but as timid. A man afraid of success. He went to the bank by himself. He got the loan. He bought the Hemmings place for a price that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier, financed with a variable interest rate that was temptingly low. With another 80 acres to work, the 40/20 suddenly wasn't enough. Roy went back to the dealer. He traded the 40/20, which wasn't even paid off yet, for a brand new John Deere 46/640. It was a behemoth with dual rear wheels and 155 horsepower at the PTO. He bought a new 6-bottom plough to go with it, and a 12-row planter. His fleet of green machinery grew, gleaming under the yard light at night, a testament to his ambition. Dale Peterson, down the road, did the same, buying a massive 4-wheel drive Steiger. The talk at the co-op diner was no longer just about the weather. It was about horsepower and interest rates, and who had just bought the latest, biggest piece of equipment. Through it all, Art just kept on farming the home quarter. He had good years too. With the high grain prices, he made more money than he ever had. But he didn't buy more land. He didn't buy a new tractor. He took the profits and paid off the last of the mortgage on the original farmstead. He took a trip to the county courthouse and watched the clerk stamp his deed paid in full. He put the rest of the money in a savings account at the bank, earning a modest 5% interest. He rebuilt the engine on his old Gleaner E combine himself, carefully grinding the valves and replacing the piston rings. He put new tires on the Farmall M. To his son and his neighbors, he was an eccentric failure. A man who, when handed a golden opportunity, had buried it in the backyard. "Imagine what he could be doing," they'd whisper. "He could own half the county by now." Roy tried to reason with him, his voice laced with a mix of pity and exasperation. "Dad, we could be rich. We could build a legacy here." Art would just shake his head and look out over the fields. "Debt ain't a legacy, son," he'd say. "It's a chain." The years rolled by in a blur of planting and harvest, of roaring engines and rising prices. 1975, 76, 77. Each year seemed better than the last. Roy's operation was a massive, humming enterprise. He hired a man to help him in the spring and fall. His new machines allowed him to work with incredible speed and efficiency. He felt like a king, the master of his own expanding universe. It was the fall of 1979. The harvest was in, another bumper crop sold at a fantastic price. Roy was in the kitchen, poring over maps of the county, talking about another piece of land he was thinking of buying. Art was in his small workshop off the garage, cleaning his tools, the familiar smell of solvent and oil filling the air. He had the radio on, tuned to the station out of Des Moines. The farm report ended, and the national news came on. The announcer's voice was grim. He talked about runaway inflation, about an energy crisis, about American hostages in a country called Iran. Then he mentioned a name Art had never heard before. Paul Volcker. the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. The announcer said this man Volcker was determined to break the back of inflation, no matter the cost. He was going to do it by raising interest rates. Sharply, Art put down the wrench he was cleaning. He looked out the small, dusty window of the workshop. The yard light cast a cold, white glare on Roy's fleet. The giant 4640, the 6-bottom plough, the 12-row planter. They looked like sleeping dinosaurs, powerful and immense, but fragile. Their very existence depended on cheap money and high prices. Then his eyes drifted to the dark, cavernous opening of the old barn. He couldn't see it, but he knew it was in there. The silhouette of the Farmall M, silent, patient, and paid for. A cold knot tightened in the pit of his stomach. For 5 years he had watched his son and his neighbors celebrate a fever dream of endless prosperity. He'd always known it couldn't last. And as he listened to the disembodied voice on the radio talking about prime lending rates and fiscal tightening, he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the fever was about to break. A long, hard winter was coming. The first sign of the coming storm wasn't in the sky, but in a thin, cream-colored envelope that arrived in the mailbox in January of 1980. Roy slit it open at the kitchen table, his coffee growing cold. His face, which had been full of the easy confidence of a man who'd just banked another profitable harvest, slowly turned to a mask of confusion, then disbelief. "What in the hell is this?" he muttered, sliding the paper across the table to his father. Art picked it up. It was a notice from the Farm Credit Bank. The interest rate on the loan for the Hemmings place, the variable rate that had been a comfortable 7%, had been adjusted. The new rate was 12%. "It's Volcker," Art said, his voice flat. He folded the letter and handed it back. "It's what I heard on the radio." 12%? They can't do that. That's robbery," Roy sputtered. "The payment will nearly double." "You signed the paper, son." "Variable rate. It means the rate varies. Right now, it's varying up." "It'll come back down," Roy insisted, though the conviction in his voice was thin. "It has to. It's a temporary thing." But it wasn't temporary. That same week, President Carter announced the grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. The news hit the grain markets like a physical blow. The bottom fell out. The price of corn, which had been the foundation of Roy's paper empire, plunged from over $3 a bushel to $2.20, and it was still falling. Suddenly, the world didn't want their grain anymore. The elevators were full, and the ships weren't coming. The spring of 1980 was cold and wet. Roy went to the field with a knot of dread in his stomach. The massive John Deere 4640, which had once felt like a chariot of prosperity, now felt like a lead weight chained to his ankle. Every gallon of diesel it drank, every hour the engine meter ticked over, was money he wasn't sure he'd ever see again. The numbers he ran in his head at night no longer added up. They were a terrifying equation of soaring costs and collapsing income. One morning in late May, as he was cultivating the new ground, the 4640 sputtered, coughed a plume of black smoke, and died. He tried to restart it, but the engine just cranked, lifeless. He sat in the quiet of the Sound Guard cab, the silence more deafening than the engine's roar had ever been. He knew enough to check the fuel filters, but they were clean. He suspected something worse. He had to call the dealer again. The service truck arrived late that afternoon. The mechanic, a young man named Kevin who chewed tobacco and spoke in monosyllables, hooked up a set of pressure gauges to the fuel system. After 20 minutes of tinkering, he spat a brown stream onto the dirt. "Well, there's your problem," he said, pointing at the heart of the engine. "Your Rusa Master injection pump is shot. Governor ring disintegrated. It's not building pressure." "Can you fix it?" Roy asked, his throat tight. Kevin shook his head. "Not out here. Got to pull it and send it to a specialty shop in Des Moines to be rebuilt. Or we can get you a new one. Either way, it's going to be expensive." "How expensive?" "Rebuild will run you $800-900, plus my labor to pull it and put it back in. A new one is closer to $1,500, and it'll be 3 days before we can get it back to you, best case." $1,500. The words hung in the air. It was more than Art had paid to buy back the Farmall M. 3 days of downtime, with the weeds growing and a rainstorm forecast for the weekend. Roy felt a wave of nausea. He gave the mechanic the go-ahead for a rebuilt pump, the cheaper option, and watched as the young man began the laborious process of disconnecting the heart of his tractor. While Roy's green monster sat crippled in the field, Art was on the other side of the farm, on the home quarter, cultivating his own corn with the Farmall M. The old tractor's water pump had started to seep a little coolant around the shaft seal. Art had noticed the drip that morning. He drove back to the workshop, drained the radiator into a clean bucket, and pulled the pump. He drove his Ford into town and bought a rebuild kit at the auto parts store for $12.50. It contained a new seal, a bearing, and a gasket. He spent an hour at his workbench, carefully pressing the old bearing out and the new one in. By mid-afternoon, the pump was back on the tractor, the radiator was refilled with the old coolant, and he was back in the field, the engine humming along at a steady 1,500 RPM. The total cost of his repair was $12.50, and an afternoon of his own time. He finished his cultivating that Friday, just as the first drops of the forecasted rain began to fall. Roy's 4640 was still sitting in the field, waiting for its expensive new heart, the weeds in his rows getting a head start his crop couldn't afford. The cracks in Roy's empire were no longer hidden. They were splitting wide open for the whole world to see. The summer that followed was a slow, agonizing bleed. The bank sent another letter. The interest rate was now 15%. Then, in the fall, another. 18%. The numbers were insane, impossible. Dale Peterson, their neighbor to the west, had his first auction. Not a foreclosure, not yet. A machinery adjustment sale, the notice in the paper called it. He sold his new 4-wheel drive Steiger and a big disc chisel, just to raise enough cash to make his payments through the winter. The prices were weak. The crowd was full of grim-faced men who were all in the same boat, no one having spare cash to bid things up. The harvest of 1981 was a disaster. Not because of the yield, which was decent, but because of the price. Corn was below $2 a bushel. For the first time in his life, Roy sold his crop for less than it cost him to grow it. He was losing money on every single acre. The grand expansion, the fence row to fence row dream, had become a nightmare of red ink. The man from the bank, the one who had once clapped Roy on the back and called him a sharp young operator, stopped calling. The friendly letters were replaced by formal notices, printed on stiff paper with threatening words like delinquent and default. Roy stopped going to the co-op for coffee. He couldn't stand the looks from the other farmers, the mix of pity and morbid curiosity in their eyes, as if they were all watching a slow-motion train wreck and wondering who would be next. He grew thin and haunted. He'd work all day and then sit at the kitchen table all night, shuffling papers, trying to find a way out that didn't exist. He tried to sell the Hemmings 80, but the land market had collapsed even faster than the grain market. The ground he'd paid $3,000 an acre for was now worth maybe half that, and there were no buyers. No one had money. No one could get a loan. The equity that had been the foundation of his borrowing was a phantom, gone as if it had never existed. The final blow came in the spring of 1982. It wasn't a letter this time. It was a car, a shiny Ford LTD, that pulled into the lane and crunched to a stop on the gravel. The banker, a man named Henderson, got out. He was wearing a suit and tie that looked completely out of place in the muddy farmyard. He wasn't smiling. He met Roy by the machine shed. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Roy," he said, his voice stripped of all its former warmth. "We have a problem. The board reviewed your file. You're over-leveraged and under-collateralized. We can't extend you any more operating credit for this year's crop." "What am I supposed to do?" Roy asked, his voice hollow. "How am I supposed to put a crop in without capital for seed and fertilizer?" "Frankly, the bank's position is that you can't," Henderson said, avoiding Roy's eyes. "We're calling the note on the Hemmings property, and we'll need to liquidate the equipment listed as collateral to cover the shortfall on your operating loan. The 4640, the planter, the plow. It's all in the loan agreement you signed. Liquidation. The word was like a death sentence. An auction. His name, his failure, printed in black and white in the county paper for everyone to see." Roy just stood there as Henderson got back in his car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled over everything. He looked at the massive John Deere tractor, its green paint faded and chipped now. It wasn't a symbol of progress anymore, it was a tombstone. He felt a pressure build in his chest, a desperate, suffocating weight. He stumbled into the dark machine shed, leaned against a cold steel post, and for the first time since he was a small boy, he wept. Art found him there an hour later. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say anything at all. He just put a heavy, calloused hand on his son's shaking shoulder. The silence in the machine shed was filled with the ghosts of bad decisions and the bitter taste of pride brought low. For years, the farm had been a place of silent division. Now, in the depths of ruin, it was finally won again. That evening, Art sat at the kitchen table with his own bank book, a small, simple ledger he'd kept for 30 years. The numbers weren't spectacular, but they were all written in black ink. He had the paid-off deed to the home quarter, free and clear. He had the savings he'd put away during the good years, the money he hadn't spent on new iron. It wasn't a fortune, but it was something. It was solid ground in a world that had turned to quicksand. The day of Dale Peterson's foreclosure auction was a grim affair. It was a cold, blustery day in March, the sky the color of lead. The whole neighborhood was there, not out of spectacle, but out of a shared, quiet grief. They stood in small, silent groups, their hands shoved deep in their pockets, their faces etched with worry. They were watching a neighbor's life be dismantled, piece by piece, and they all knew it could just as easily be them. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man from out of the county, tried to work up some enthusiasm, but his patter fell flat against the somber mood. The bidding was slow, reluctant. A lifetime of hard work was being sold for 10 cents on the dollar. When they got to Peterson's main tractor, a clean International 1066 he'd been so proud of, the bidding stalled out at a heart-breakingly low number. Dale stood by his wife, his face pale, watching his legacy evaporate. Then a new voice cut through the crowd, clear and steady. 7,000. Every head turned. It was Art Jensen. He was standing near the back, his old canvas coat pulled tight against the wind. The banker, who was overseeing the sale, looked surprised. A few neighbors exchanged glances. Art hadn't bought a new piece of equipment in 20 years. A machinery jockey from a nearby town bid 7,100. 7,500, Art said immediately, his voice unwavering. The jockey shook his head and backed away. The auctioneer pointed at Art. Sold, to Art Jensen for $7,500. Art didn't go to gloat or to inspect his purchase. He walked straight over to Dale Peterson. He took off his glove and stuck out his hand. "Dale," he said quietly, so only Dale could hear. "I don't need another tractor. But you do. You're going to come farm with me this year. You'll run this 1066 on my ground and what's left of yours, and you'll pay me back when you can. We'll get through this together." Dale Peterson looked at Art's outstretched hand, then at his face. He saw no pity, only respect. His eyes welled up, and he gripped Art's hand like a drowning man. In that moment, the whispers about stubborn old Art died forever. They were replaced by a new, quiet respect. Here was a man who had not just survived, but had held on to his humanity. The next day, Art and Roy drove into town to see the banker. They walked into the bank, and this time it was Art who did the talking. He laid the deed to his paid-off farm on Henderson's polished desk. "Here's what we're going to do," Art said, his voice calm but firm. "My farm is worth, even in this market, $250,000, and it doesn't have a dime against it. You're about to take possession of the Hemmings 80. You'll sell it at a loss. I'm prepared to buy it from the bank, right now, for cash, for what it's worth today, not what my boy paid for it." He slid his bank book across the desk. "And in return, you will release the liens on my son's machinery. He needs it to work. We need it to work." Henderson looked at the deed, at the bank book, and at the old farmer's steel-grey eyes. He was a banker, but he was also a man who could recognize when he was beat. He saw a way to get a toxic asset off his books without the mess of a public foreclosure. He made a call to his superiors in Des Moines. An hour later, they had a deal. Art Jensen bought back the 80 acres his son had lost for less than half of the original price. The foreclosure auction was cancelled. Roy's name would not be in the paper. Life on the Jensen farm changed after that. The line that had divided it was gone. It was one operation again, but it was run on Art's terms. The big 4640 was used sparingly, only for the heaviest tillage to save on fuel. Most days it was the two old red tractors, the Farmall M and the newly acquired International 1066, that did the bulk of the work. Roy found himself back on an open-station tractor, eating dust, the sun on his neck. But it was different this time. The roar of the engine didn't sound like a failure. It sounded like survival. He learned to fix things. Art taught him how to time an engine, how to set the points on a distributor, how to weld a cracked frame. Roy's hands, which had grown soft in the climate-controlled cab, became calloused and stained with grease. He lost his arrogance, and in its place grew a quiet competence, a deep, first-hand knowledge of the iron he worked with. He and his father worked side by side, from sunup to sundown, often in silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, born of a shared purpose. Years passed. The farm crisis slowly loosened its grip on the heartland. Prices recovered, but the lessons of the bust were not forgotten. The community had changed. The flashy, debt-fueled expansion was over, replaced by a cautious, hard-won wisdom. Art Jensen became an unlikely elder statesman. Younger farmers, the ones who had survived, would stop by his workshop, not to talk about horsepower, but to ask how to rebuild a carburetor or how to make a crop on a shoestring budget. He never preached. He just showed them, sharing the knowledge he'd carried for a lifetime. One warm Saturday afternoon in the late 1980s, Art was sitting on an overturned bucket in the shade of the barn, watching his son. Roy was leaning over the engine of the Farmall M, showing his own boy, a 10-year-old named Thomas, how to check the spark plug gap with a feeler gauge. "See this?" Roy said, pointing with the tool. It has to be just right, not too wide, not too narrow. This old tractor, it's simple. It doesn't have computers or sensors. It just has spark, fuel, and air. If you understand those three things, you can always make it run. Your grandpa taught me that. Thomas looked up from the engine, his face smudged with grease. But why do we still use this old thing, Dad? It's so old. Roy stopped what he was doing and wiped his hands on a rag. He looked at the old tractor, its red paint faded to a soft patina by decades of sun and work. Then he looked over at his father, who gave him a slight, knowing nod. "Because, son," Roy said, his voice full of a gentle gravity he hadn't possessed as a young man. "This tractor doesn't own us. We own it. It taught me the most important lesson there is about farming, about life, really. It's not about how much you can borrow or how big you can get. It's about how much you can endure. It's about what's left after the fever breaks and the bills come due. This tractor, this is what's left." Art watched them, his son and his grandson, their heads bent together over the old four-cylinder engine. The sound of their voices mingled with the chirping of sparrows in the rafters of the barn. The sun cast long shadows across the farmyard, shadows that touched the old barn, the modest house, and the fields stretching out to the horizon. It was all still here. They had held on. He felt a deep, profound peace settle over him. The legacy wasn't in the number of acres a man owned, or the size of his machines. It was in the lessons passed from one generation to the next, a chain of knowledge and resilience forged in the heart of the land. And at the center of it all, standing silent and steadfast in the afternoon light, was the old red tractor, a humble monument to the simple, enduring truth he had always known.